Welcome to the Dennis Report. I'm Dennis Atchison. Education plays such a key piece in building a community and a province and a country. Media tends to report post-secondary education, university level, in terms of student debt, lower enrollments, higher tuition costs. A lot of negativity in the experience for young people, and it would make you wonder why they would want to go to university in the first place. Also attached to that, we hear stories about how hard it is to find a job once you get out of school. Today's guest is going to change the color of that whole conversation and bring great insight, enthusiasm, and knowledge to the university experience as it is happening here in New Brunswick. We're really pleased today to have George MacLean, who's the Dean of Arts at UNB in Fredericton. George is also a returnee to the Atlantic Canada region, having been born and raised here, and has gone away and built his career and has now come back. Welcome to the show, George.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks for coming, and I like to start with that theme.
Sure.
Because around here, there's a lot of conversation on how do we improve the population of Atlantic Canada, Maritimes, and specifically New Brunswick. And you're one of the ones that came home.
Right.
So what was that journey like for you?
Well, it was a matter of time before I came home. My wife and I are both Maritimers, and we went away for a year or two, and a year or two became 25. But we always had it in the back of our minds that we would return to the region. And since I've been Dean of Arts at UNB, we've been thinking about that in a broader way. What can we do at the university level to attract people from outside of the region? Just this morning, as I was getting ready to come here, I was happy to learn that we've been able to bring in a candidate who was being courted by a university on the West Coast, and this time of year in particular, that's a challenge. and we were successful. And this is someone who has local roots, someone who has maritime roots. And so I think in part telling my story, which was all of the advantages and the benefits of coming back to a place that you think about as home, went a long way, I think, with that conversation. So it's been a special period in our lives, and it's been 7 or 8 months now, and it's as I like to say to my colleagues, so far so great. Yeah.
Good. So it is fairly recent, isn't it?
It is. That's right. July of last year, we came back.
Great. And was there children? I know a lot of times to move involves uprooting children and stuff, but maybe you're at that phase where the children are come and gone, or it's not part of the equation, so you were free to move back? Partially
free. We have 2 children. I have an older daughter who's still studying in Manitoba, and she elected to stay there. My younger daughter is at Fredericton High School, and you know, when we were thinking about this, we came out and we visited family and we made a trip of it, and we thought about what would it mean to move to Fredericton and to New Brunswick. And when I told my younger daughter that the offer was there and we were considering coming back, she would be going into grade 11, and she said, you know, Dad, it's 2 years of my life and it's the rest of your life, which is a very mature comment for someone who is 15, 16 years old. Okay. But we've turned it into a bit of an adventure. You know, my wife is an educator, and she's looking at developing a new school in Fredericton with a different type of curriculum and working with people there. And so it's, I think it's about looking at your opportunities and bringing back those skills. It's not to say the skills aren't here. What I've noticed is I'm surrounded by some of the most incredible professional and just some of the most special people that I've worked with throughout my career. And it's really a matter of just bringing together all of these great minds, whether it's in the university community or working with people in the community. It's just an incredible thing.
Fun. Your original roots, though, weren't Fredericton, were they?
No, that's right. I was born in Sussex, and I grew up in Nova Scotia. But we have family in all 3 provinces, and so you don't have to go very far to bump into someone who either knows someone you're related to, or you might be related yourself. So,
that 1 degree of separation.
The 1 degree, that's right. Sometimes it's not even that.
Oh, fun. So I once lived here for a while, and then I went away for about 6 years and came back.
Right.
And I was walking down the street one day, and the person I used to play basketball with said, "Hey, Dennis, where you been? I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks." And I was gone for 6 years, you know?
Yeah.
And it gets into that, one of the beauties and charms of Atlantic Canada or Maritimes is it doesn't change very much, even though there's lots of pieces that do change.
That's right.
So have you found much of a change?
I have, you know, and I think sometimes the benefit of being away from a place and coming back demonstrates just how much things change. I've had conversations with friends of mine who have stayed here all of their working lives, and often the comments will be, well, you know, you'll notice not much has changed. And in fact, much has changed, whether it's in my hometown in Nova Scotia or what I remember of coming to visit in Fredericton to visit friends and family. So that relationship and that community development and changes, I think, is it's a constant, really.
Fun. So you're back older and wiser.
Older and wiser,
and bringing your skill sets with you.
Yes.
Have you always been in the post-secondary education university field?
I have. I went to university and discovered that I really, really love it, and so I thought I should stay here. I remember in my second year, I never thought I'd be a university professor. I had everything else mapped out perfectly, as many students do in their first year. They know exactly what they want to do until that epiphany moment comes around. And I remember being in a class and listening to a lecturer, and I thought, if I could do this or anything like this, this would be a dream. And so that was something that I just continued to pursue.
Fun. And was the passion always political science, or were you pulled in other ways? And to go back a little bit, when you were younger, what was the dream before becoming a full-time academic?
Well, the dream is often something different entirely than what you think you might wind up doing. I always thought that I might go into a career in law or something along those lines. That wasn't really the dream, though. I mean, the dream was, I think we all had it, whether it was to be a, you know, someone in the NHL. For me, it was music, and that's still a very avid hobby of mine. But it was a different area in the academic life that I was pursuing. But the political side, especially with regard to world politics, was always something I was interested in. I was that kid in grade 3 who would come home and watch the news or read the newspaper. I delivered the newspapers and read them cover to cover, page to page as I delivered them. So there was a point, and I was talking with my wife about this last night. I remember a moment speaking with an advisor at King's College in Halifax, and we really started to dig into areas that I was passionate about. And he said, you know, why aren't you pursuing politics? Why aren't you doing more things along those lines instead of looking at a career that you think might work for you? And that too was one of those moments when I thought, I think he's right. He's opened up a door that was probably there all along, and I hadn't really been paying much attention to it.
Fun. Mentioning old television programs, John Kenneth Galbraith's series, which would be lovely to bring something like that back again. We need that depth and slowness.
Absolutely, almost. Yeah.
Fun. So academic life brought you back here. So the University of New Brunswick, it's the main institution in the province. Small province, big institution, small institution in a bigger region. Funding's always an issue.
Yes.
Lifestyle for the students is an issue. There was a piece in the paper not long ago about student enrollment down. But that's always gets in the stats and how much they vary or what perspective they took to portray that story that time. So can you give us a broad brush of what campus life is like these days, and then we'll fork from there into how education is such a root indicator for economic well-being of a province, literacy levels in a province and stuff.
Right.
But as the mothership for the province, you guys carry, and I'm generalizing a bit, but you're Dean of Arts, and that's one of the larger faculties, and it touches so many different areas and themes. So can you just go play in that area for a little bit about the school and where it wants to go and how you think you're going to get there? That's
right. Well, when we think about the region, because it's more than just a provincial issue, although with regard to funding, of course, it's provincial. But in a university like UNB, we're constantly looking at our peers and our colleagues right across the entire Atlantic region. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on, because some opportunities lie there in the region. But UNB is different than most of the dozen or so or 16 institutions in the region, because it's really one of the 3 main research-intensive universities, Memorial, Dalhousie, and the University of New Brunswick. And in fact, in the province of New Brunswick, 75% of research is carried out. And certainly the Faculty of Arts is one of the larger faculties, largest in terms of its size, at UNB. And It's also one of the most diverse faculties. And you asked about the tone and the sense on the ground on campus. And one thing I noticed right away was the tremendous diversity in this particular faculty. One reason why I always wanted to come back to a university this size was because it's small enough that you can get things done and you can really get to know the people who are your colleagues, your community. And it's large enough that the research funding is there and the diversity of programs is there as well. So whether it's clinical psychology or creative writing, or whether it's media arts and culture or public administration, the faculty has such a wide range of programs that I like to call it sort of the Goldilocks faculty, because it's not too big and it's not too small. It really is just right. And so one of the things that I've been pushing back against when we have conversations on campus about dwindling numbers and size, and more and more the conversation is how do we find that niche? And my response is, oddly enough, our niche is really diversity. Our niche is actually our size, because we do things differently than some of the other universities in the province, and terrific universities, but they have a different mandate. And UNB's mandate should not be to be the same as one of the others. I mean, UNB is a different type of institution.
Yeah, very much so.
So the opportunities, I think, lie in the diversity. And more, as I've been talking with my colleagues right across the region, we recognize that we should be, you talked about a sandbox, I mean, our sandbox should be all of us in it rather than competing. We had a conversation last fall, all of the deans of arts from across the region. We had a conversation and someone said, what are the issues we're facing? And they were similar. Dwindling numbers, shrinking budgets, constraint on programs, making priorities. And we began realizing that we all were having the same conversation. How do we find our niche? And a few of us thought, well, maybe that niche ought to be something different. Maybe it needs to be innovative and different than what everyone would expect it to be. Why shouldn't we be pairing with each other to create programs that allow us to use the courses and the resources that are at other campuses? What if, for instance, you had a niece or a nephew who lived in Ontario and decided to come to the Atlantic provinces to do a degree, but not just at UNB, at any university? So they would come and they would enroll at one university and they'd wind up doing their degree at a number of different universities without all of the bureaucratic administrative headaches of going from one institution to another, paying their tuition in one institution but getting an Atlantic degree. This is something we're talking about right now. It's a new idea, and it might make a few people nervous when they're thinking, this isn't the way we've done things. But maybe the way that we need to do things is not necessarily what everyone's expecting us to do.
Yeah, that evokes memories of when the MBCC, or the Brunswick Community College System, was trying to dovetail its credits into four-year university programs, so that the MBCC student had the opportunity, if they decided to take a degree like in St. Andrews here in tourism, that they could then expand or not lose those 2 years and start from scratch with year one for a BA in that area. So it sounds like trying to integrate the service delivery so the students better served.
And I think, if you don't mind, I think those doors need to remain open. I talked about the innovation in our particular faculty, and we have degrees in our faculty that we didn't have at institutions I've worked at that are twice the size. So our applied arts degree is actually in concert with the craft college. I mean, this is a degree that doesn't exist at most other places. So you can go to the craft college and you do half of your degree and then you come to UNB. Those kinds of conversations, I think, are important because they allow us to say, what's the value that can be brought to the table from an institution that perhaps has nothing to do with ours, but brought together allows us to do things even better. It becomes a real non-zero sum game.
To riff a bit with this, but maybe a different direction, but it's a common theme you get out of the media. So I'm appreciating that maybe you've got a lot of great stories on campus that media might not always pick up, because the stories will tend to portray student enrollment up, tuition is up 3 to 5% every year, class size continues to increase, challenges with the faculty association, and all those mechanical dynamics instead of the spirit of something. So buried in there, there's got to be some fun, good stories where the collaborative effort or a program breakthrough created some of the next wave of stars. Or young people that then come back enthused. It's like a sports program when you win a championship, and then it's easier to recruit the following years because you've done something that's drawn some attention, and those students go back and speak at their schools and say, this is the experience you have at that school. Do you have any versions of that story yet, that something's really hot and humming up at UNB that no one knows about because the media will tend to portray the conflicts instead?
Well, I understand, first of all, I understand why the conflicts tend to get attention. And when you look at the numbers, it does appear to be stark. But if we do a closer analysis, we recognize that to look back 10 years isn't really helpful, because 10 years ago, Ontario had their so-called double cohort, where grade 12 and grade 13 students graduated in 1 year.
I remember that.
Tens, or not tens, but thousands of students flooded outside of the region into campuses across Canada.
Yes.
And it skewed the numbers for 4 years. And so we've been still dealing with that. And this new normal, whatever it might be, is also affected by demographic changes. And for the first time in a couple of generations, we're probably looking, where we are looking at, a slowdown in numbers. We have to adjust to that. If we're constantly playing the numbers game, we're not going to get ahead. And it's not all about tuition revenue. It's not all about whether we're drawing in students. You know, it's got to be a more deep-seated, long-term conversation about what our campus should look like and what our student body should look like. Will we be looking more at graduate students? I think we will, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. Will we be looking more internationally? Of course we will. It's an interesting campus in that across UNB, you know, about 3/4 of our population are local. I mean, they're at least they're Canadian, if not coming from the province. And every year, about 40% of the students coming into UNB are the first students to go to university in their family, which is a tremendous number. That says that something is happening right, where 40% of those students are coming in and they're the first ones. I had a meeting with a student a couple of weeks ago who was coming over from Prince Edward Island. And he came over with his entire family, including his younger brother, and I tried to recruit him too. I think we might have him. But this family, no one in their family had gone to university. And they had lots of questions about what you'll do with an arts degree.
Yes.
But you could tell, just looking at the passion of this student who's in grade 12, and I know he's coming, looking at the passion, you could tell that the parents were ready for this, and they knew that good things would come of it. So beginning with the students on campus, I've seen such energy and enthusiasm for their programs, for their campus. This year we have students in our faculty who, for the first time, are forming a society of students that is faculty-wide. And I think this is a tremendous thing because it builds community amongst our students. We've been really focusing on engaging students. How can the students, not just in first year, but in second year and third year, how can they develop that relationship with each other, develop that cohort, so that by the time they get to their graduating year, that connection with the institution is with their alumni, it's with their professors, it's with their campus. And it's an easy place to start because there's such spirit on the UNB campus to begin with. But I'm excited about that students on their own are coming to us to say, we've got these ideas, would you support us? And it's a very simple thing to say yes to because we're not doing any of the heavy lifting. One big event that happened this year, which I think we're all really proud of, was the 60th anniversary of Goose Lane. Now, Goose Lane isn't directly related to UNB, although it once was.
But it's very enmeshed.
It is enmeshed, and you know, it began in the creative writing program. It was a spin-off of the Fiddlehead Journal, which is one of the 4 journals which are in the Faculty of Arts at UNB. And I should say, most universities don't have their own journals. We have 4 in our faculty, and some of them, you know, they are the Fiddlehead, for instance, is the oldest journal of its kind in Canada.
It's long running.
It's long running, and so that Goose Lane celebration allowed us to shine a spotlight on the creative writing program in our faculty. And when we began to look at what's been done, we realized over the last 10 years, graduates in that program have published over 40 books. I just couldn't believe that the sheath of pages going through all of these publications, 2 of them in the last 2 years were nominated for the Giller Prize.
Very cool.
Now, this is UNB. This is the creative writing program, and there's no question it's got to be one of the strongest programs in the country, and certainly a flagship. In our media arts and culture program, one of the innovative new areas is in video game design. Now,
there you go.
You might be thinking,
no.
Okay.
No, I have a son who has a MBCC degree in game design. So.
And you know, and then you probably know the gaming industry is bigger than the movie industry.
Oh, yes.
And the interesting question that was being asked by people in our faculty was, what about the people in computer science who don't have the design aesthetic. They don't have the design background. Could we bring together the design experts with the technical side? So partnering with the computer science faculty, and we offer a joint degree. We have this program in video game design. There isn't another one in the region. And you know, if we had twice as many professors and twice as many seats, I'm sure we could fill them.
Yep.
That's part of the strategy, and what I've come to see is that a big part of my job is facilitating. It's working with colleagues, it's working with the faculty in my programs to say, well, okay, here are all of our needs and the resources that we have. What's the best way to go off and make the case to our senior admin that this is something that needs more resources? The last thing I would say is this, and I want to go back to students. In recent years, we've been focusing more on how we can integrate our students at the first year level. Yep. How do we provide the advising and the tutoring and that direct assistance so that students don't come in just wondering what to do? Yep. And we've noticed, for instance, in examining the output, the success rate of students, that these new programs that we put in place are leading students to well, they're doing better academically. We can see that through the numbers. We're retaining numbers better than we were before with this direct connection. And I actually think the most important metric, if you want to use that way of examining it, the most important issue is how students define themselves. Because when we ask them, they say that they feel more competent, they feel more relaxed. Their evaluation of their own self-efficacy is going up because they're taking these programs, which we are looking to further integrate into our arts program so that every student benefits from this. Right now we're comparing students in and out of these programs. Yeah. I think that's exciting because it's paying more attention to that experience of the student, getting them involved in their program so that they'll want to take on research projects, they'll want to do advanced degrees, they'll want to stay on and maybe pursue careers in academic life. But of course, as we know, most of our students won't. They won't stay in academic life. They're going to go off to other aspects in society.
This is really exciting because the enthusiasm, the insight, which is great, but also you're getting to give us a peek inside the walls of the institution to see the juice and the flow and the energy that's there that needs to become more part of the mainstream storytelling.
Right.
10 years ago, even just a couple of years ago, if you went into a high school and asked how many students are going to go to university, you'd get maybe a third of the room. Right. How many go into community college? You'd get about half the room, and then the rest were the undecided. And that had a lot to do with dollars. Yes. And it had a lot to do with not the impact of debt.
Right.
It was really factoring into a lot of their thinking whether their parents had been able to get the 18, 19-year-old to understand that do you really want to come out 4 years later, 5 years later with $40,000 in debt? Right. But if the experience is shifting, which gets into what are students like these days. I remember asking a prof at St. Thomas about 10, 12 years ago, something's different on campus these days. Students have gotten pretty serious. You know, the days, although they're still partying and all that stuff, but there's a different tone to how a student in 2014 is compared to a student from 1994 is. And then the institution, the school has to adjust to that. It sounds like you found some pieces that allow that to be good for them.
I'd like to think we were serious too when we were there, at least part of the time.
Got me.
That's right. But I think you're right. Students are focused in a different way than we were, and I'm glad you raised this issue because it's important for us to look at it holistically. So as an old friend of mine used to say, well, he said, I spent $40,000 on my education, and you know, my buddy spent $40,000 on his truck. Which depreciates faster? Well, we know the answer to that. When you look long term at the value of a university degree, any university degree, there's no question. Every study says the same thing: that earnings are up right away, and they continue to go up. More importantly, job satisfaction and mobility within a career field go up almost right away, and they continue to do that.
Does that tie directly to an arts degree? Because there'll be that other chatter out there about, well, an arts degree, it's not going to get you a job. That linear thinking.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that.
That's an answer to that.
The longer term studies, and there was one just recently this year that was done by the Association of Universities and Colleges in Canada. A few years ago, York University did one as well, and this is what they did differently. Instead of asking people 3 months or even a year out of their degree, what are you doing? Do you have a job? And it'll happen this summer. I'll predict that this summer, post-Encina, post-convocation, there will be a story in the local newspaper or on CBC or some other any network, any news program looking at graduates who can't find jobs. The issue, though, is at what point do we begin to see those students engaged? With an arts degree, more often than not, they tend to do something else afterwards, which is perfectly acceptable, and it's actually been that way for a very long time. Yep. And part of our job as educators in the university system is to work with students from the beginning so they know what they're moving into, and they know how to market themselves, and they know how to be able to apply skills. Because they may be doing something else, and as I like to say, people, look, you might be doing a program after your degree, but if you didn't have that degree, you'd never be able to do that program. Yep. So when we take a look beyond 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, what we notice is that in the applied sciences, in the natural sciences, and in the arts, the social sciences and the humanities, that 5 years out, no question, students in the arts, the humanities and social sciences are not doing as well financially. They may be happy, but they may not be doing as well financially. You get to 10 years and there's almost parity. And you get to 15 years, and those students who began in the arts program, uniformly, these studies show us, are more satisfied with their careers. They've had more mobility in their careers, and this is the real knockout of the park, they're making more money. Last year, again, one of the Canadian associations, this was the Association of Canadian Association of University Teachers, did a study to find out once and for all, does an arts degree earn you the mythological $1 million?
As if that's the end game.
Right, that's right, as if that's the end game. But to follow through on this, because for years we've heard this, if you get an arts degree during your lifetime, you will earn $1 million more than if you didn't. And the answer is, in fact, yes, you do, and it's more than that. When you track it out over time, people who are 30 years out and 40 years out, they're doing much better than they were if they had not done their degree. This is not in any way to suggest that other degrees don't offer the same thing.
Exactly.
I'm specifically talking about the arts degree here. And so whether it's satisfaction, money, or progression in the workforce, the answers are always yes, yes. But there's one other point, and this is where I would always begin. With that conversation with the person saying, do I want to spend this much money? What's your passion? What is it you want to do with your life? Because maybe someone's telling you you should be a mechanical engineer, and you discover in your first year that you hate it. Not surprisingly, we find that our faculty tends to be the one where people come to from other faculties more than any other, because they've discovered they don't want to do a degree in another field. But when you sit down with your nephew or your niece or your son or daughter and say over the kitchen table, what is your passion? Where do your interests lie right now? Can we find people who can give you the advice so that you're not walking in blind? And more often than not, when you find the person whose passion happens to be in the humanities or in the social sciences, they're going to pursue that passion, and something good is going to come of it.
Yep. This is great. Your story about 10 years, 15 years, 20 years out reminds me very much of many conversations I've had, not only with my twin sons when they were 16, 17, but also with athletes I'd coach in different times as they hit
How were they twins if one was 16 and one was 17?
No, sorry. Good man. It was about when 16, 17-year-olds get hit with, what are you going to be when you grow up?
Yes.
And I would joke with my boys, you're going to have all these adults coming at you with this stereotype or archetypal almost question now.
Right.
My wish for you would be 25, have a degree of some kind, and don't be in debt.
Right.
So you've got almost a 10-year window to play with to help answer the adult questions. But as you mapped out, we know 5 years out they're in this situation, 10 years out they're in this situation. That's exactly how it unfolds, because who at 16, 18, 25, I would say, I know 50-year-olds that don't know what they want to be when they grow up.
Right.
So their education has to have that malleability and that adaptability and not hook you financially. Right. At the first 10 years of that window when you start to move into a bigger world.
That's right.
So it's reassuring to know that the long-term research now shows that these things do fit. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back shortly.
Mile marker, mile marker, count 'em off, son. Between what once was and what's begun.
And we're back talking about post-secondary education with the Dean of Arts, George MacLean from UNB Fredericton. And we were just riffing on students as they are today and the long-term consequence of having a Bachelor of Arts degree. So where do we pick it up from there? There was the context of what are you going to be when you grow up question, to the long-term positive impact of a Bachelor of Arts degree, to how students are today, and the extra measures that school's taking to integrate them into a really positive experience.
Right. I'll tell you something about that. A colleague of mine in the United States and I have, we've written a few textbooks, university-level textbooks, and we've focused on introductory textbooks because we think this is the most important time you have when students are walking in and can you turn that light on? Can you be that? Yep. Can you be the moment where they click? And we thought long and hard about how we wanted to introduce the subject matter, and we thought it was important to deal with this question right away. What will you do with a degree in arts, whatever field it might be? So we had our own ideas about the skills that we would learn and the strengths that someone with an arts degree can bring to any environment. But then we decided, let's go to our own students. Let's find our graduates and speak to them and find out what they're doing and ask them what they would say about their degree and their experience. The first thing we discovered was that the sheer number of careers that these students that we had been part of, and we had been the beneficiary of having some time with them, the sheer number of careers was so much more than we ever thought it would be. So we decided to list them in the first chapter of this book, and we had to push hard with the publisher to say, look. Yeah,
did you have a limit on how many pages you could publish?
Well, we did, but we thought this is important because it gets students engaged right away. When you have that conversation and you say, here are some of the areas, and it begins to get the mind working. Oh, I could actually do that. I could go in this direction or that direction. But the consequence of all of that was that we completely rethought how we would position an arts degree to our own students, because we had the feedback from the students who had just recently gone through. And we realized that we were actually missing a big chunk of what this experience had been for these students, because it enabled them to go off in different directions. Some of them were technical writers, some of them had gone on to careers in politics, for instance, or others had become clinical psychologists, or they'd moved into the health field or into publishing and media. And we had anticipated some of this, but we hadn't really thought about just what the wide array of experience and possibilities might be.
Fascinating. Can we turn in a different direction?
Certainly. Political
science?
Yes.
We'll go there. I'm assuming you have license to speak as you wish about politics of the day?
I'm an unlicensed, no, sure, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Yes. Because you can add some depth of understanding, probably the historical context to how we got to where we are today. But the theme that I'd like to play with a little bit is that it feels like there's a shift occurring, and there's greater awareness in a general population, a greater willingness to participate, even though they might not show up at the polls. But there's a greater level of engagement, greater level of awareness, sometimes social media, sometimes issue specific. Everyone sure can grab onto an issue and shake the tree pretty hard, but they're still looking at the politician as the place or the fulcrum where the change occurs.
Right.
Is there a different dynamic to politics today than maybe 20 or 30 years ago, which then ties to the young people and how they get engaged or want to disengage because they still see middle-aged men in suits? There's more women, but not as many yet.
Right.
So they still feel disengaged from the decision-making process that affects the quality of their lives.
It's an excellent question. I think in some ways we're going through another wave of evolution of the body politic or the political system. We go back 100 years ago or so, and the suffragette movement in Canada and the votes and the right to vote being given to women in the first wave of feminism, beginning in Manitoba and moving through the provinces. And then in the 60s with the civil rights movement, we saw the field widen even more in terms of that active engagement in political life. I think now we're looking at a new I wouldn't say necessarily fully revolution, but it's an evolution of how we see ourselves as part of the political community. As I like to say to my students, there's no room for cynicism, but there's lots of room for critical analysis of politics. We don't want the cynics in the room, but we want to turn the cynics around to have them actively engaged, because cynicism, I think, it almost gives us license to turn off. You know, I don't want to be involved. All politicians are the same,
Yep.
and all elections are the same. But when we really think about it, especially in small communities like the ones we live in this province, we know the politicians.
Yep.
They are people we went to school with, and they're people that we're neighbors with, and we know that they care, and we know that actually that cynicism, it's a cheap way to approach political life.
Yep.
The flip side of that, though, is the movement, the shift in the media landscape, where you mentioned social media, for instance, which has its pluses and its minuses. I worry about citizen journalism, for instance, and the problems that can be encountered with that.
Yep.
But at the same time, it does allow for a widening of the field and more voices being heard. We need to be critical. We need to know more, I think, in order to filter that information. And I think what worries me as a political scientist most is that it's becoming easier for us to really just focus in on our pet issues. So all I want to be involved with is, you know, demographics, or I'm only interested in youth engagement in federal politics or something. And I'm going to close off to everything else, because my news feed, whatever it may be, electronic or otherwise, can become so specific, and I can become an expert in that one area, but I miss the bigger picture. So the generalists out there, the generalists need to be celebrated. The people who can bring that more wide-ranging approach to political life, the people who can speak to the issues, both domestic and international, and say, here are the connectors, because the connectors are there.
Yep.
That's the worry that I have, that we may be missing that. So there's benefits, but there's also some costs.
Yep. One of the long-running themes in New Brunswick is that when an election rolls around, it tends to be quite tribal, or maybe I want to call it tribal, because there's the red team and the blue team.
Right.
There's a couple of other teams that have surfaced, and they move around and stuff. But that consistent pattern of the four-year election cycle driving social policy, policy for economic development, and then it rolls over. Even if, because we've had two successive four-year terms,
right,
and that's a first. And so 8 years, maybe you can institute your policy that you want, but at some point, does the window finally open for a politics of convergence? And that the larger issue finally takes reign, rather than, oh, vote for us, we get you the job, we take care of your road, that culture.
Yes.
It feels like, after paying attention to this for 20, 25 years, it feels like little New Brunswick's almost ready to recognize the one degree of separation instead of, you know, blue and red or orange and green, and go, if we're going to make a step forward, we have to get into the politics of convergence instead of the divergent model we've been using. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting when we look at the most recent election, and I should say that my specific area is not in electoral politics, although I take an active interest in it, and it's unavoidable, you know, as a political scientist. Right. But when you take a look at where people's preferences were, what were they voting and how were they voting, and you begin to realize that there's really quite a spectrum of New Brunswick voters out there. And the fact that this was a province that elected a Green politician, that's not been done in most provinces. That says something about the richness of interests and the richness of opportunities out there, and the range of options that are available to us. But what you're touching on here, this notion of convergence, is an interesting one. If we look at this federally, I mean, there was a period, certainly when I was an undergraduate studying political science, where third parties were just that other thing that happened. Politics, we were primarily a two-party state.
Yes.
But what have we seen over the last few decades? Well, in the United States, the Green Party made a huge move. In the 2000 election, the Reform Party movement, the American Reform Party movement, was a huge player with Ross Perot. We saw this in Canada as well. And now we have a multi-party environment federally. And I think that's trickling down in many respects. People are beginning to see that if we're not going to have outright convergence, because when we speak of convergence, when we look on the spectrum of political parties, most of our political parties tend to occupy a small amount of real estate on that spectrum. They're really not wildly different.
Yes, exactly.
And it's hard to differentiate oneself in opposition versus in government. So we're left with one of two options, I think. One is where we see this convergence of ideological opinion in one area, or we begin to see the diversification. And I think that diversification is becoming more acceptable. It's more acceptable to say, I'm going to take a different option. I'm going to vote in a different way than what the pollsters might tell me that I should be voting, or this is the way things have been done historically. And in a province like this, I feel in so many ways, this is a province on the cusp of huge changes, and they've been going on for some time.
Yep.
We're seeing that nationwide, actually, but certainly New Brunswick is an example of that. So why should provincial politics be any different?
It's always been fascinating to me when getting into more diversity. Therefore, you might have a legislature or House of Commons that's got 4 or 5 voices based on a different value system for social democratic or liberal or conservative. And then the pushback comes. It's like, oh, it'll be more dysfunctional if there's too many voices.
Right.
Because you're going to have this fractious body that can't make a decision together. And yet history shows, if I'm accurate, that Canada created its most progressive policy when it had to have a 3- or a 4-way conversation rather than just a 2-way conversation. So it's always fascinated me why that never came to resonate for those that want to challenge that the 2-party system is the best way to go, because then you can be in power and you can implement policy and create change. But the greatest change came when the 3 entities or 4 entities had to check each other off or have that kind of conversation or narrative. That then it did become progressive. I still remember in Ed Broadbent's book called Pursuit of Power, and he's telling a story about when the NDP became the balance of power for the Trudeau government. And he said it was a masterstroke by Trudeau because he has a minority government. And he called me into his office 2 or 3 days later and said, we're going to take these 10 or 12 points from your platform. We will implement all of them, but I want you to support the national energy policy, which then jammed Mr. Broadbent for his Western support on a national energy policy. So it's that strategy of that version of politics. But it was also where the greatest change came from for reforms to several things. So the NDP could claim a degree of success for that mechanic. But I just like the whole storyline that it was creative, it was adaptable, and things changed for everyday Canadians because the political system had to adapt to each other.
That's right. And I think we are undergoing, and we're still undergoing a major change federally, and this is happening at a provincial level too, where the diversification of ideological perspectives and parties is becoming more viable, and we still haven't figured out how to deal with that. You know, we're not European in nature. We're not Germany, and we're not France, and we're not Italy. We haven't figured out how a multi-party system works, or a system where proportional representation might be a more nuanced way of directly connecting voters with their elected officials. And here's where the paradox lies in my mind. On the one hand, you go to Canadians, and polls show this over and over again. The Canadians say, I want, you know, citizens tend to respond this way, that they would like to have a variety of interests represented in elections. So they want to have the options. But then when they're asked directly, and this has happened in Prince Edward Island, and it happened in British Columbia, when someone says, how about let's get rid of this first past the post simple plurality system of voting, where the person who gets the most votes gets to run the ship, why don't we have a system of proportional representation? Surely that should work, because what you're asking for is more diversity, and voters say no. So it is, and I think it tells us something about where we are in that process, where that's such a major change, and it really would be. And people say there are certain things that we'd like to cling to.
Doesn't New Zealand have an excellent method of proportional representation?
Yes, and it's interesting too, because the issues come up often in Australia too, where people talk about, well, what if we required people to be part of the process? What if we fined them if they didn't show up to vote?
Negative reinforcement.
Right, the negative reinforcement. And we can all think of people in our lives who we'd rather not have voting because maybe they don't have the information at their disposal. I'm being a little facetious.
That's fun, though.
But the idea that not taking part in the political process is in and of itself a political act in many respects.
Yeah, I did a commentary during the last provincial election on what if the other 40% decided to vote.
Right. Yeah.
You know, because then you would, to participate, number one, and what if the electoral office of New Brunswick, chief election officer, actually put that on the ballot so that it becomes a legitimate act.
Right.
Rather than spoiling your ballot, you can pick none of the above.
Right.
And include that in the tally with how media report that. Democracy Now!, a group out of Ottawa, also has this funny video clip with a gentleman that used to be on the Air Force called Drooping Democracy. And he talked about 100% of the people vote, or 60% of the people vote, 50% of that 60% goes to the winning party, so with 30% roughly of the total eligible votes, you get to be in power. You have 100% of the power.
Yeah. You know, one last element that just as you were talking, it got me thinking about the demographics of voting too, because when we look at what's changing and what's not and why aren't things moving around a little bit more, one element that seems to be bucking the trend or the conventional wisdom, and that conventional wisdom is, well, you know, young people aren't engaged. And what we're finding when we take a look at it, when we drill it down, that there's a tremendous amount of engagement there. I mean, look in the last American election where youth votes were through the roof. When things become more focused and where youth feel as though they're more energized and active in the process, we ought to expect those numbers to go up. So we shouldn't be complacent to say, well, you know, the issues of the day are going to be solved entirely by the older demographic. We might find ourselves surprised when suddenly the younger demographic is saying, wait a minute, social changes mean that I'm being impacted more than in previous generations, and maybe I'm going to take a more active role in what's being done.
Yep, it'd be the inverse of what your daughter told you about moving to Fredericton, where she said it's 2 years of my life, but the rest of yours.
Right.
It'd be the inverse of that.
Yeah.
It's the rest of my life, so I'm going to start to get engaged with this here, which would be great, which would go back to the university setting and trying to get young people to not only find their heart and their passion and start to manifest it and be nurtured and mentored through that, but also that bigger social sphere that they're going to enter one day, which is public engagement and civic engagement. Do they still teach civics anymore? I know in the high school system, watching my boys go through it, and past lives I was a candidate in a couple of provincial elections, talked to high school students, and for them, their exposure was one unit of a class in grade 9.
Right. Yes.
So they, and it wasn't their fault. They couldn't differentiate provincial, federal, municipal. Couldn't differentiate parties. They definitely knew what they wanted,
right,
and they knew what they liked, but they didn't know how to apply it. So it needed a bridge of some kind.
Right. Strictly speaking, what you're describing might not be on the books, but there's so much of that that actually takes place in the context of the courses being taught. I remember when I accepted the position as dean, I immediately talked to my department chair in my faculty and said, I'd like to teach courses, and he said, which courses? And I said, I'd like to teach intro classes. I'd like to get right in there. And he proposed a class on issues. And I love this course because we're talking to first-year students and we're dealing with concepts, but we're really pushing most of that stuff aside to deal with the issues, to say, you know, how can we understand what's happening in the world around us right now, and how can we understand the legislative process or how things are done at the UN practically? And then let's attach case studies and examples. It's a different course than I've ever taught before, and I'm loving it because it's forcing the other side of my brain to work in ways that it didn't, and the feedback from the students is direct. That type of engagement and that type of issue-oriented education, I think, is absolutely essential. And you know, you're getting it from students. And what we're seeing more and more is that looking at and identifying the things that students need in order to be successful in their university degree, and once they're done, that's part of our responsibility. It's part of our job. We've been looking more and more on how our students can become engaged experiential learners. So they're not just in the classroom, but they're involved in research with their instructors, or they're moving towards co-op programs or internships. And
the volunteer type program.
Yeah, exactly. And we've made an internship program in arts an actual credit. So students are going off to work at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, or they're working at the hospital, and you know, they're not making photocopies, they're actually doing a job. They're not getting paid for it, but they're actually earning a credit for it. And so they come back and they do the academic side, which is matched with this. Personally, I'd love to see this, and we're talking about this, I'd love to see this expanded to the graduate level, where our master's students are doing this as well. Because one of the sidebar advantages of this is we discovered that about 50% of the students who are taking this as a course wind up getting offered jobs. So these are art students who thought, okay, I'll do a half credit with the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, or they're with the archives, and then they get engaged in short-term contracts, and these turn into actual positions. So that experiential side, that's on us. We need to establish and find ways for our students to be able to be active learners. The classroom is necessary. The classroom is an important part of the process. But in order to provide that full education spectrum, our students also need to be, or at least to have available to them, some of the other options.
Practicum element to it.
Exactly.
Do students learn differently now? Here's a bit of a setup for that. It's fascinating to watch the impact of technology or different curriculum design elements as we learn more about the brain functions or body functions. That here's the latest sexy new way to teach math. Here's the latest sexy new way to approach this or that. And yet the human being and his or her cognitive processes and biology and the power of the gut and the unification with the heart and the mind, it's the same. It hasn't changed since we've been around. So Can you speak to that tension about how curriculum wants to adapt because there's this new sexy thing that's a teaching method,
right?
And yet the human being basically needs a blackboard, some chalk, and a really good relationship with the teacher.
Right. One thing we've been really good at for generations is the industrial model of education at universities. You know, you come in, you're in a large classroom, you sit, you take dictation or whatever it is, basically you go back, you memorize it, and then you're in a smaller class. And then maybe by the time you get to your third or your fourth year, suddenly now you're being engaged with your instructor. If anything's changed, it's that we've focused more on students as social beings. So I've talked before about the pros and cons of media and technology. I think if we use the pros, and if the positive aspects of that, we can change the model at least somewhat. So this is the first year, for instance, I've used social media in teaching. And it's actually fascinating, and it's because I talked with professors who are newer than I am, and they've made suggestions, and I thought, you know, I should be doing that.
So what do you do?
Well, there's actually Facebook pages and Twitter feeds set up with my course. The course is, it's not an online course; it's still face to face.
Yes, yes.
And I say
but
to
it's
students,
a complement to it all.
It
conversation
is. That's
outside
right.
the classroom.
It is indeed, and we do things differently in the classroom. It's set up in such a way, you know, we stop, we engage. It's a large classroom, so it's hard with numbers like this.
Yep.
But having sidebar conversations going on in social media is helpful because students, you know, someone will put on Facebook a question or a topic, and suddenly that becomes engaged with the other students. And
well, yeah, you might have 5 comments, but you've got 500 readers.
Right.
So they'll follow the pattern of the conversation. They
will indeed. And I've given up trying to control electronic devices in my classroom. You know, I used to always said, you know, none of that. And I recognize for every 5 students who are taking notes, there's someone who's playing online poker. But you know, that's on me too. So my job, I think, is to wander around the classroom and keep the students engaged, because if they're falling asleep, well, that's partially their problem, but it's also partially my problem. So, you know, we've got to be working together on this. And if they're falling asleep, it might be because human beings shouldn't be sitting for an hour and 20 minutes listening to someone lecture. We need to stop, we need to stand up, we need to move around, we need to engage and change the classroom format. But I'll also encourage them, if they're, as long as they're not texting, as long, or you know, playing online poker. But if they are, again, that's something that I need to be thinking about.
I could just picture in an amphitheater type 1 student going, woohoo!
Yeah, exactly.
Because they hit a jackpot.
That's right. As I joke to my students, you know, if you're looking down at your lap and chuckling, you might be doing one of 2 things, and I suspect it's texting, and you shouldn't be. But I'll say to students, look, if you're online right now, and I'm tossing out something, and you're seeing this, and we might be using web pages or videos in the lectures, and you've got questions about that too, integrate it, bring it in. And a student will say, well, I just checked this, and that's changed. Or I've had students correct me on things, and it's important to be able to back up and say, well, yeah, this is actually helpful for all of us. I can't deny it. Yeah. But in terms of the way students learn, I think in some respects what we're recognizing now is that industrial model that I talked about before was never really the best one.
Nope.
And it requires change on our part as educators and administrators to see that there may be different ways that we can be more productive in what we want to see our students get out of their experience in our classroom and in our programs. And if we leave our ears and eyes open to the suggestions that are being made, particularly by our younger colleagues, but also by the students themselves, and take a risk, right? Take a chance and say, look, we're going to do it this way. And if it doesn't pan out, we've at least tried.
Yep. We have about 2 minutes left.
Sure.
I'm trying to think, what is a nice way to close with this? Because it's wonderful, the passion around students, how they learn, academics being malleable or adaptable, which means there's a whole life going on that campus. That this is great that you're sharing it, because we get to hear it and people get to watch the show and be excited by it. So what would you like to end with about 1 minute and 40 seconds to your passion, what you would like to see, your vision for where this can all go?
Right. I think we'd all be better off if we saw the university as part of our community more. We recognize that what's happening there, it's not just up the hill or on the outskirts of town, taking place in a different world. It may be to a certain degree. Everyone's work environment is somewhat separate.
Yes.
But if we recognize that that's part of our community, these are our students. You know, in some cases they're our children. These are our colleagues who are working there. And it's a very large community of people who all have a passion for their research. They have a passion for their fields of interest. The students themselves desperately trying to get through their degrees and moving on to the next level. I think the important element from all of this that I would feel, I feel very strongly about is that all of us feel connected, that these are our universities, that these are our communities, and that what happens there, it's important for us to be aware of what's taking place and to share in that excitement and in that enthusiasm.
Terrific. Thank you so much for coming and taking time out of your day.
Yes.
Thank you for watching. As always, you can watch this show on YouTube on The Dennis Report if you search for it there, and on Facebook as well on The Dennis Report. To end, be good, have fun, and love each other.